Thank you.
Perfect. Well, Amber, thanks so much. And I'm glad that we're able to be together tonight. I know you and I were joking earlier that we kind of must have seen this coming because we already had planned on doing a Zoom presentation for this. So thank you for having me.
Absolutely.
It is such a weird time. And, to be honest with you, I mean, gosh, like everything has sort of changed in the last week or two. So as you mentioned, I'm the Director of Admission at Georgia Tech. And, on March 14th, we put out 23,000 admission decisions for regular decision. And probably within the next 48 hours, we moved all 30 of our full-time people into remote situations. And right now, like a lot of colleges, we are trying to figure out how to give information sessions, live information sessions like this to students who would normally be coming to visit campus. And, as we talk through this presentation tonight, I'll speak a lot to going to campuses. And, it's just so unfortunate right now, I think, especially for seniors, because they may have been admitted to a couple schools and have never visited. And it's going to be a challenge for them to figure out, the right choice in this type of an environment. And we'll talk a little bit about timeline, and that might help families understand a little bit about why now is so critical. But April for colleges is by far the biggest time to visit. For us at Georgia Tech, we were expecting about 13,000 visitors in the month of April. And so being in this kind of new normal has been a challenge. But I think, like everybody, we've also been looking for kind of the silver lining behind coronavirus and sort of this new environment. And one of the things I would tell families is you're going to find that schools are adapting right now to put a lot better online content out there than ever before. And sometimes it takes a crisis to force change. And I think that that's certainly going to be the case, right now. I mean, I know a lot of my colleagues around the country are working on this, launching YouTube channels they didn't have before, getting a lot of their students to do testimonials, leaning on people around campus. So anyway, we'll talk through that. But I guess most importantly, I just want to thank everybody for taking some time tonight, or if you're viewing later. I put a couple of my resources here. This is my Twitter handle, Clark to College. We write a weekly blog at Georgia Tech that is not about Georgia Tech. So for the last 5 years, we've written on pretty much a weekly basis, and we might use Georgia Tech, as I will tonight, as like an example, but we're not preaching the Georgia Tech gospel. We are not trying to sell Georgia Tech in any way. We're trying to tell families and help families understand, here's in general how schools make admission decisions. Here's in general how you can make a good campus visit. And a lot of that is what we're going to talk about this evening in this presentation. And then last September, through Johns Hopkins Press, I did publish this book here at the bottom called The Truth About College Admission, a family guide to getting in and staying together. And we think it's a really practical guide for families, whether you have a 9th grader, 10th, 11th, or now even a senior. There's something in there for everyone. And we end every chapter with questions, and you'll see some of these questions in here tonight, because one of the things that my colleague, Brennan Barnard, who writes for Forbes and works at Harvard and also at Dairyfield, which is an independent school in New Hampshire. He's a counselor there. We want families to go about this in a healthy way, to have fun with this experience, and, to bring some levity to it as well. So that's always my goal, and hopefully, we'll accomplish that tonight. So with that, we'll get started. And I'm not going to be looking at the chat, so if you certainly let me know if you see questions pop up that we should pause on. But okay. I guess let's first start with the problem, right? And the problem is not coronavirus. In this case, I think the problem that, this like elephant in the room that we all have is, if you're tuned in watching tonight, then you're probably a family that highly values education. And most people wouldn't say that's a problem, but it can be a problem actually at times, in some of the school environments and some of the neighborhoods and communities that you live in, because in those type of settings, students rarely stop to ask big questions around why they're going to college, because all the expectation is you're going to college. It's the foregone conclusion. And so when like Aunt Sally comes to visit for Thanksgiving dinner, as a junior, before you've had a chance to even like take a sip of your water, she's asking, well, where are you thinking about going to college? And I think that that's sort of putting the cart before the horse a little bit. And so what I want to do tonight is back us up, and help to kind of see a really big picture, and talk through like the solution to that concept. And so, what I would hope is that your family, as you go through this experience, and we're pretty intentional about not calling it a process, but calling it an experience, is just to ask that question, like to have students actually write down or voice record or however they feel comfortable doing this. Why do they even want to go? Because a lot of students are in college preparatory schools, or they take advanced placement classes. And the idea, again, is just this foregone conclusion of the next logical step is college. And too few students, and I mean good students, talented students who are bound for lots of success in the future, don't ask that big question of, well, why do I want to go? And that's so important because, if you have a sophomore or a junior right now, you're probably getting barraged by colleges. This stuff is coming in the mail, and it all kind of looks the same. Every school tells you that basically it seems like, you only study outside under trees with professors, and, there's like kids of different ethnicities on all of these brochures. And, on the next page, you got some kid in Spain, like standing up on top of a rock, looking out over the ocean, imagining life's possibilities. And it just this big like deluge and whirlwind and cacophony of go to college, all your options and that kind of thing. But I think it's important to start by asking big questions first, so that when that stuff comes, you can actually do a better job digesting what is a good match, what's a good fit, and what's not. And so I hope that, you'll challenge your family and challenge your son or daughter to ask questions like, who are the kind of people that bring out my best? Who are the kind of people that I like to be around, that, that challenge me, that inspire me? Because that's the kind of question and answer that you can then be looking for when you hear what colleges have to say. And what environment, helps me thrive and learn. And I was talking to a school yesterday, and their entire senior class is about 100. And it's a K through 12 school, and every grade has about 100 students in it. So, these are students who have grown up going to class where everyone knows them, where, the person writing the recommendation letter might have taught them twice or coached them and taught them. They are known, and they have small classroom settings where they have discussions, and they've gotten used to this environment. And is that something that they want to replicate in college? Or are they so sick of that intimate environment? They're ready for some, they want a little bit of anonymity, and they want a little bit of, just sort of variety. Those are really good questions to ask, because what you're going to find is, the sort of hamster wheel of college, again, especially from families who highly value education, can fool you into just getting more myopic and more focused on this place or that place, or, numbers, instead of broader, bigger questions about who you are and who the kind of people around you should be, or that you want to be. And then, questions like, how do I hope to experience what do I hope to experience in college? And then what do I want kind of when I graduate from college? So these are the kind of things I want to start with. And I mean, one of my hopes is that, you'll stay broad. And we talked about this a little bit already, but words to me matter a lot. And you'll hear admission people talk a lot about the admission process. Or when you read articles in, I guess we don't really have newspapers anymore, but like whatever, online articles about the admission process. And if you go and Google process, this is what you get. So go to Google Images, put in process, this is what you get. And I think this is how high school students start to feel a little bit, is I'm a red guy and the goal is to become a purple guy. And so I want to make sure that I'm doing all the right things along the way. And there's this one very mechanical way to do things. And if I don't, get this certain score on a test, or if I don't, make a certain grade in this class, like, there's going to be this like wedge driven between the orange cog and the green cog, and everything's going to fall apart. And too often you hear students express things like that. And so, what I would hope is that instead of feeling that way, that it's a process, that it's mechanical, that it's got to be done just the way somebody tells you, because then you feel this way, right? Like,
I'm sorry to interrupt you. We're still seeing the slide, the first slide.
Oh, really?
Let's go ahead and
the very first slide.
The very first slide. Sorry, I didn't realize that you were moving through until you mentioned the different colors you saw. Let's see about screen sharing. If you can hit that bottom on the button of the bottom of the screen.
Okay, sure.
See if that works for us.
So it looks like I've got, I'm going to pause my share. Your screen sharing is paused. I could try a new share. Let me see. Let's see if this might work. Resume share. Let's see. Is that better?
I see a gentleman on a tightrope.
Yeah. Now the question is, can I? Sorry. I think now what I'm doing is I'm sharing my screen. I want to share this, which is my PowerPoint. Now, do you see the guy again?
I still see the guy.
Move through?
I am not seeing any movement.
Oh, really? Okay. I can, let me stop this. Sorry. I'm going to try.
Hang in there with
us,
I'm
back
audience.
On screen, right? Sorry.
There we go. I see process or experience.
Okay, perfect. Okay, great. Now, the question is, do you see me moving slides?
Solution. We're on the solution board now.
Yes.
Excellent.
Okay, good.
And I can also tell that Ashley has joined us. Thank you, Ashley. And here we go again.
Here we go. All right, so we talked, now it's probably more logical. We talked about a problem. We talked about a solution with questions, right? And then this idea of process or experience, this being what I was referring to. This idea, right, that as I said, it's mechanical, there's one way, and this is how, again, high school students can kind of start to feel a little bit, is you have to follow a certain path if it's a process. And so I would hope people would, help students get off the tightrope, feeling like if they don't take this number of AP classes, or if they don't make this score on a SAT or an ACT, like that's not how it should be approached. That more so, if you go Google image experience, that it's more like, okay, there's a lot of ways to do this. There's a lot of ways to, an end that is, quote unquote, the right place. But people start to feel like, you have to go from red to purple. And they get focused very much on becoming purple, right? And whatever the bumper sticker of purple is, or whatever this particular type of school is at the end. And that brings a lot of consternation. I think it brings a lot of frustration along the way. And so again, my hope is that people will look at the admission experience, and that families together will experience this. And it actually is an opportunity for growth, and it's an opportunity to come closer together. if people, I think, will be a little bit more open and a little more broad. So that's what we're going to kind of talk about. Again, a lot of families right now are kind of getting this stuff in the mail. And, on behalf of college admission people everywhere, I just want to apologize for spamming your mailboxes here. But what I would say is, if you have answered those questions, if you've kind of asked the big questions, it'll be a lot easier to figure out what matches up with your why and what doesn't. And so one of the things I would say is I hope that families would consider having basically 3 boxes in their house, or 3 boxes in their room when this stuff starts coming in. One of those is a match box. Right? It fits. This is a fit, or this is a match. I understand what I'm looking for, why I'm going to college, like the type of environment that's good for me. And I feel like this resonates. So I'm going to put this here, not just because of the name of the school, not just because mom or dad went there or didn't go there, or I've heard of it before, but legitimately, like, this is a fit or match for me. The other one is like, oh, not for me, but for a friend, right? I know so-and-so, and this would be good for them. And then, if you learn nothing else from this presentation tonight, just one simple word, which is recycle. So, let's don't be lazy and just throw this stuff in the mail, in the trash rather. Just let's save the world one college brochure at a time. So again, just the environment here and recycle this stuff. Because it is coming fast and furious. There is no question. So one of the things that I want to, I guess, give people here, since we're having an evening class, is a little bit of a quiz. And clearly there is not, any prizes. But I want to just kind of start out with a quick quiz. And I was going to see if I could actually see the chat myself. Is that like the Q&A portion?
See the chat down below, and then there's also a Q&A section. I don't know if you're able to open that chat section.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to mess anything up. So anyway, I will just trust you if people get this right. It's on your honor here. But in terms of quick questions, like, first, how many colleges or universities are there in the United States? Hopefully people aren't so fast that they saw that.
We have an answer that says 3,500.
That's a good guess. That is a great guess. Actually quite close. There are about 4,000 total schools in the United States. 2,200 of those are 4-year. So public, private, community colleges, for-profit, not-for-profit. Point being, like, it is a vast landscape. There are tons of choices and tons of options. And I think too often students start to narrow this unnecessarily. And one of the things that, I'm hopeful is that you'll keep an open mind. There's a lot of possibilities out there. And actually the coronavirus is starting to show that a little more, because press is really covering all the different things that are happening around the country. And right now you're seeing a lot of coverage around colleges, which, in some ways is good, I think, because it helps to reinforce, what gets lost sometimes. People start to think there's only, 100 schools out there because those are the ones we hear about. Okay, so how many colleges do you think accept 1 out of every 3 or fewer? So basically, their admit rate is 33% or less. So, if you've got a 2,200 4-year schools, let's take that group in particular. What percentage do you think take 1/3 or less? Any guesses there?
Nothing. 30%?
Yeah. So, all right. So 30% of maybe that 2,200.
And then
so
a second guess of 50 out of 4,000, and a third guess of 25%.
Okay. All right. Good. Good. So that is certainly the way things get covered. That it is very hard to get into college. And really that's inaccurate. The average admit rate right now nationally for four-year schools is about 67%. Most colleges are accepting most students, but I was a journalism major in college, and the rule number one of journalism is, like, if it bleeds, it leads. And so people love to cover Stanford, right? I think Stanford's admit rate last year was negative 0.083. They were like denying kids who didn't even apply, just sending them emails and being like, sorry, you didn't get in. And so we start to focus on the Ivies, or we focus on the Stanfords of the world, and people start to believe, that that's what's happening, that it's really hard to get in. But the truth is, most colleges accepting most students, there's only about 15 schools in the country that are under a 10% admit rate. And so this is, I think, a really important, piece. So thinking about, out in the Pac-12, even with Stanford's negative 0.083 admit rate, what do you think the median admit rate is for the Pac-12? So schools like those listed here, and Arizona State, et cetera. That one is, and I'm sure some people might chime in with questions, but about 3/4. So about 74% admit rate. And I think this is just important because it's reinforcing the idea that the landscape's very different than what students think it is. And it's a lot more broad than a lot of people consider. And the narrative that's out there is it's really hard to get in, or even if you do get in, you can't afford to go. And the truth is that that's really not totally accurate. Another question, number of undergraduates attending Texas A&M system schools. So not just the one in College Station, but all together. What do you think the total number might be? So that answer is about 100,000. About 100,000 students in those Texas A&M system schools. And again, if one of the reasons that students go to college is to have a big network, then that's something for them to be considering. Throwing this one out there, just number of schools starting with the letter B. You love the letter B, you look good in the letter B, about 300 choices. Again, broad landscape, lots of options. This is my son, and this is a picture. You probably couldn't appreciate this fully, but he's in a magnolia tree. He's like 8 feet up and 8 feet out on a branch there. And this kid shimmied up that thing, in a sweater vest, which I find impressive. Nonetheless, we were taking holiday pictures and came around the corner to find him doing this. And he's mimicking Rafiki from Lion King 1.5. And he says, "Look beyond what you see." And what I would tell you is I think that's the goal for families in the admission experience, is to stay broad, to look beyond what you see. A lot of people get very focused on certain schools in their area or ones they've heard of. And so instead of just the places that you're familiar with, I hope you'll coach your student to look broad and to stay open. And that's really so key. This is from the Chronicle of Higher Education, and it's some good data that shows, not just the acceptance rate over on the far right side, but then also the retention rate. In other words, the number of students returning from their first to second year. These happen to be just for public institutions. But, as you talk with schools, you'll find that the national average retention rate is about 68% for four-year schools in the country. But here's what you have is a lot of schools that you've heard of, a lot of schools that are accepting more than they're denying. It's not terribly difficult to get into a lot of these schools, and yet they're doing a tremendous job of retaining their students. And so what I would say is that as you're looking at some of the data and as you're thinking about colleges, asking about retention rate is really important. What is the retention rate? If students are leaving, why are they leaving? But high retention rates point to a couple things. They point to students being academically successful. They're able to return because they're doing well. They're financially able to afford it. And so the school is doing a good job of making that education affordable. And then lastly, you would assume they've found a place they're happy, and so they're coming back. And so retention rates, I think, are a really important number to understand and to ask about. And so I hope that as you're kind of launching into this, whether it be online or through the stuff they send you in the mail or some of the online collateral that they might email you as well, look at those retention rates. I just want to kind of pause and see if there's any questions. And then, we were going to talk a little bit about like how schools review applications and then how they make decisions. But are there any questions that we should pause for, or should we move forward?
There aren't any questions that have come through yet. One that I have that I'd like to ask on behalf of our families is how families can help manage stress and help manage anxiety through this process of looking at schools, and really speak to the options that they have. You mentioned a lot of options with schools taking higher applicant rates, schools having good retentions. If there's any other tidbits you have about addressing that anxiety.
Okay, absolutely. Yeah, and I will talk in a bit about some of the things I think that come between families in this and how they can navigate that. So I do have a couple like what I call wedges that we'll talk about, which I think will get exactly at what you're asking about there. So yeah, I will certainly hit on that. I guess to understand first, like, how do schools make admission decisions? Nationally, there's basically two ways that and
Rick, I'm going to interrupt you for a moment.
Schools are making their decisions.
I apologize.
Yeah.
We lost a little bit of your audio there. Could you start back at the beginning of this statement?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Is that better?
Try again.
Hopefully that's better for you. Okay.
It's getting better, yes. We got you.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay, great. What I was saying is that there are basically two ways that colleges make admission decisions around the country. One of those is in a formulaic manner. Basically, what they're doing is they're just saying, what are the grades that a student has made? And what are the classes potentially they have taken? And combining that with test scores. And so, in California, you can go to the California State website for all of the California State schools there, not the UCs, but the California State system. And you can see a formula that they give you. In Iowa, that's also true. In Georgia, you can see I give an example of Georgia University. So around the country, there are a lot of schools that are making decisions. And one of the things people do get stressed about is, I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to get in. I'm not sure what schools are looking for. But a lot of schools are making very formulaic admission decisions. They're just putting in a formula. And you can see Georgia State as an example. But one of the things I would tell you is this is like kind of like running hurdles. They set a certain hurdle height and a student just jumps over that or they don't. And so you can see, for instance, this SAT being at a certain, overall score. They put in a formula. You can tell it's very black and white, and that's how they're doing it. And then similarly, a lot of schools are giving you very overt information about financial aid. So Auburn University has an example saying right here on their website, if you make a certain test score, then that amount of money there, $16,000, is going to be awarded if you have a 28 or 29 ACT. And so what I would say is that, around the country, a sizable number, particularly of public schools, are making their decisions in a very transparent, very open-facing way. And so there's not a lot of questions, surrounding this. And I would say that every student should have at least one school that they feel good about possibly attending that is making decisions this way. So it's very easy to understand. If what most people though brings consternation and brings some of the stress you're referring to is the fact that other schools are using what they call holistic review. And so if you've had stuff come to you in the mail, or if you've maybe visited some colleges, you've probably heard admission people talk about holistic review. And what is that? It's basically the fact that admission decisions kind of come down to two things. One is supply and demand. So the number of applications for the number of seats in the class dictate the admit rate. So to give you an example of that, when I came to Georgia Tech, we were getting a little over 9,000 applications. We had 2,200 seats in the class, and we were using a pretty formulaic manner of review. We were admitting about 65% of students who applied. Over the course of time, since I've been there, we now had this year 41,000 students apply. The admit rate was 20%. The class size hasn't really grown that much. And so again, supply and demand dictate. So if you're applying to a school or interested in a school that's getting far more applications than seats available, they are most likely going well beyond just grades and test scores, because most people have good grades and test scores. What I would say is in holistic review, they're also not going to be totally focused just on a GPA, but they're going to be looking a lot at things like course choice and selection. In other words, they're going to start with, where do you go to high school? What could you have taken? What did you choose to take? And then how did you do in those classes? And then with test scores, what they're going to usually do is something called super scoring. And so essentially what that means is they are going to be taking your best possible SAT or ACT from various sections and putting those together to give you sort of the benefit of the doubt with your testing. But again, having just come out of admission committee over the course of the last couple of weeks, that doesn't get you very far when you've got so many talented students applying. And so that's why schools begin to look at, how do they build a community intentionally? And they do that by asking questions like, what is this student doing outside the classroom? What are some of the ways that they're having an impact or an influence on people around them? And so, and back to your question too, Amber, I think a lot of people are concerned that, I need to do this certain group of things. One activity looks better than another. And that's really not true. I think what you're hearing admission folks ask in committees is, has this student been involved? Have they had an impact on people around them? And essentially, when they leave high school and they leave their family and they leave their community, are they going to be missed? And so it's not about checking certain boxes, but more so that admission people want to know, okay, we have a good student here. They can do the work. That's not the issue. The question is, who are they going to be in our community? And, how are they going to kind of fit in to help us build a class that is interesting and that's going to make each other better? So they want to bring students who have done all kinds of things along the way.
Rick, I have a question here from the community. And the question is there a disadvantage to being homeschooled? And I think this question is a great one because it speaks to a lot of our community members. And I'd like to broaden it up and also ask, how does homeschool education get taken into consideration given those points you just laid out for us?
Okay, it's a great question. I would say that obviously within the homeschool realm, there's still great opportunity to challenge and push and stretch yourself. And so there again, what we want to see is what could you have taken? And so laying out a curriculum. This is the way when you read homeschool applications, they are very clear about the curriculum choices that they've made and why they've made those choices. And that's all admission people want to know is why did you, first of all, decide to go the homeschool route? And how do you feel like, and how can you demonstrate through either short answer questions or through something called additional information? How can you provide admission committees with context that give them the sense that, you know, this student has challenged themselves, they've chosen to do that, that they're academically prepared. And from a curriculum standpoint, I wouldn't say it's too different, in all honesty, than going to any type of a traditional high school. The bigger question for homeschool students, though, is, and where I think sometimes there's a higher standard held, is, okay, if you are in a homeschool situation, what are you doing with your time when you're not maybe as hemmed in as other students are to, you know, a very rote day? And so when we read homeschool students, that's one of the big questions we're asking is, you know, if this student theoretically had a little more flexibility with their time, are they using that well? And of course you ask that same question of any student, but I think that's definitely a question. I mean, I can say for both the scholarships I've read for, as well as for, you know, I was at Wake Forest University, at Georgia Tech, and that's certainly the question that we ask surrounding homeschool students. So, you know, hopefully that helps a little bit. I wouldn't say it's all that different, but those are the kind of questions that are being asked. You know, how have you used your time outside the classroom, and how have you made an impact with that?
Thank you for your
the last
answer.
thing, you know, is, of course. The other thing that all schools are going to also have are essays and short answer questions. And we won't go into this because there's a million resources out there. But I think, you know, back to like the stress part of your question earlier, like how can you help students to like keep this in perspective? What I tell students is, because they do get very stressed about the essay, is they need to remember who's reading these. I think they have a very inaccurate idea of who's reading these. I've asked this question. I also do a little bit of work at the State Department. So I've had a chance to travel around the world to embassies and, you know, travel around the country with my regular day job. And I love to ask this question of students, like, who do you think is reading your essay? And, you know, they think that the person on the other side of that is, you know, got like a red pen and patches on their jacket, and you know they just want to bust them for a comma splice, you know. And that is so inaccurate. You know, the people reading these they're people, right? And I actually think the coronavirus is going to have an opportunity to show that a little bit more to students, that we're all going through this together, and it's not machines on the other side of admission. It's people, you know, who are trying to now homeschool their own kids because they're all home together. And so helping them to say, listen, you know, this is just a person on the other side, like take a breath. What I tell students, the tips I give students for essays that seem to help a little with the stress is two things. One, when they write this, actually ask them to print it out and to read it over and to look at that. And then to imagine dropping it on the floor, you know, either in their school building or, you know, in some place where there's people around that know them. And if someone picks up that essay and they couldn't return it to them because it didn't have their name on it, that is a bad essay. Because if someone can't read it and know it's yours in a small setting, then there's no way then it's going to have any type of, you know, impact with someone reading it in an applicant pool of 10,000 or 20,000 or whatever it may be. The other thing I would tell students is to give that essay to their mom or their dad or someone else and tell them to take it to another adult that they don't know, and have them write down a couple words that they get out of it. So, they can hand, mom or dad takes it to work, they hand it to a colleague reads it. This is, again, just another adult who doesn't know them. And what do they get out of it? What are the things that really stand out to them? I think that is really helpful, because essentially what that's going to do is it's going to give the student a sense of, oh, wow, that you're not getting my main point, or, that's not where I was going with this. And it's a good litmus test. And so I think that essays are one of those things that stress students out, and there's some easy ways to help coach them through it. For parents, I would always say here, try not to be a second author on this, but to be like a helpful editor, along the way.
I really
we
like
won't go
those
too much.
recommendations. Those are things that are good for kids they can practice and control. So thank you for those.
Yeah,
I do
of
have
course.
another question from the community.
Sure.
And this one sort of comes back to how we opened this, mentioning the coronavirus. And the question is, how do you think the holistic approach might change given that juniors may not have test scores because of the virus? And as some of you probably know, ACT, SAT sites have been closing down over the last couple of weeks due to isolating each other and not spreading the virus. So how do you project, or how do you speculate on that?
Well, you've already seen in the last couple of days a couple more schools going test optional. Some of them are going test optional, period. They're just saying always and forever going forward, we're test optional. And I think, for instance, like Oregon and Oregon State just went, Boston University just went. There's been probably 5 or 7 schools just in the last couple of days. My guess is a lot of those conversations were already happening on their campuses, and they just expedited it. There are a couple others, and I can't rattle these off quite as quickly, who have decided to do 1-year or 3-year provisions, where they're saying we're going to go test score optional for next year or for the next 3 years, and they're going to kind of watch their data and see how students do, and then potentially move forward. So they're kind of like rolling it out more as a pilot. So I do think you're going to see that for sure. I think for schools that don't go test score optional, and actually let me give you a good resource if people don't know about this already. There's a website called FAIRTest, FAIR test.org. And in the horizontal nav at the top, there's a test optional list of over 1,000 schools in the country, that don't require test scores. I used to work at Wake Forest University. They are one of the very well-known and early adopters of that test score optional policy. But a lot of schools are doing that for the year ahead. A lot of schools are gonna, if they keep test scores, I think what a lot of schools will say is, okay, we understand that maybe a student didn't get to test in the spring of their junior year. They're getting less opportunities. So for that super scoring side of things, I think schools are going to use that sort of professional judgment. Related to that, but similar concept is, a lot of schools right now are looking to go pass fail, right? Instead of giving like, numerical or alphabetic grades this spring, because they're moving everything online, I'm hearing from a lot of colleagues on the secondary side that they may be issuing pass-fail grades. And I think the same thing is true in a holistic fashion. Schools are going to say, okay, yes, we care a lot about what the student chose to take, where they could have taken, what they chose to take. Now, in this semester, we're not going to know what they made, but we have a pretty good trend line of how they were doing, and we have either all of the senior fall, or we can get like mid-semester grades to make, for instance, an early decision or an early action decision. And so I think what you're going to see from colleges for this junior class is a lot of grace, a lot of understanding. I mean, again, we're all impacted. So it's not like only Massachusetts couldn't test, everybody is going through this. And similarly true for extracurricular stuff, right? I mean, all these kids who, tennis is their thing, or, They're usually in this big competition in the spring, and that's off now. But it's global, and this is happening for everyone. And so I would say what you're going to see is a lot of colleges operating on a lot of understanding, and holistic is really going to earn its name next year. It's going to really be that because of this.
Thank you for that insight. I have another community follow-up question. For test optional schools, how should students decide whether or not to share their scores?
Good question. So 2 things I would tell you. First of all, it is absolutely fine to ask that exact question to the school you're applying to. There's nothing wrong with asking that question. What I think you'll hear them say, what I typically hear schools say is this. One, you can look at their middle 50% ranges. Schools will typically publish the middle 50% of students who were admitted the year before. So for instance, let's say a school has a middle 50% SAT band of 1320 to 1440. What that means is 25% of admitted students fell below that range and 25% above. If you're applying to a test score optional institution and your test score falls in the top quartile, or even I'd say in the top 50%, then I think you would feel confident in applying there, sharing your test score, and feeling like it could help. It's certainly not going to hurt, right? That would be kind of the general advice you'll hear from a lot of schools that are test score optional. There are students, though, plenty, who fall in those ranges and choose still not to because they still feel like it's not representative. They look at their classes, they look at their grades, and they think, gosh, that's still not reflective of as good of a student as I really am, even if it's in the top half of last year's admitted group from that school. So ultimately, of course, like everything, it's a personal family decision, but ask the school, nothing wrong with that. Especially as a prospective student and a non-applicant, right? As a junior, ask them. They will give you their answer. But I think the answer you'll hear broadly and generally is what I was just saying.
Excellent. Thank you so much for taking time to meet with us today. I don't have any other questions from the community. I don't know if you have any final thoughts before we wrap up here. Oh, actually, I did get one last question.
Okay, yeah.
Last question here. How many college courses can kids take during high school and still enter as freshmen rather than a transfer student? It's very specific.
So, well, that comes to the number of college allow.
And I'm sorry to interrupt you again, but we're having the same audio issue. Can you start at the top again?
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
Of course. Yeah, no problem. I would say, so it's sounding to me the question is, how many courses could a student take in high school and transfer in for credit? Is that correct?
Can still be considered a freshman. So I think it's, what's that threshold between coming in as a freshman and a transfer for college credits?
Okay, that's a great question. Here's how colleges define a freshman, is that they have not graduated from high school. So this is especially important as it relates to financial aid. So in other words, we see students come in often with 50 or 60 hours of transferable credit. But for financial aid purposes and for housing and that kind of thing, they're still considered a freshman because they had not yet graduated from high school. So the date of graduation that a student lists on their application is what dictates, quote unquote, being a first-year student or a freshman versus being a transfer student. College courses taken after date of high school graduation automatically kicks a student into a different level, which is the transfer categorization, if that makes sense.
To me, it's sounding very specific. If you're in high school, regardless of the number of classes you're taking, you're considered a high school student, not a transfer student, so a freshman.
That's right. exactly.
And then I do have one more parent question here. If you have content to share on interviews and recommendation letters, that's a really big area to cover, but I was hoping you had a couple of insights on those.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
So with interviews, one of the things I would say about interviews is I highly recommend students actually record themselves first being interviewed. In our book, we give a ton of questions that we've seen colleges ask, but you can imagine what they would be. And so it's really helpful for a student to see themselves on video answering questions, to see how they're holding themselves, to actually hear how their voice is sounding, to pick up on some of those nuances. And, you know, colleges do this too. I mean, at Georgia Tech, we spend a lot of time videotaping kids being mock interviewed before they go in to sit down with companies for the exact same reason. And it also helps students to, if you run them through some questions they may see, and you can Google for this, or like I said, we do talk about that in the book and give about 50 questions that are common, but get them to just give responses and work out their answers. The one question anybody who's interviewed anyone for a job or a scholarship or anything else knows that's ultimately coming is, you know, what questions do you have for me? And that is, to me, that's the turning point of an interview, because the truth is that admission people or alumni or whoever is conducting that interview, they really don't want it to be an interview. They want it to be a conversation. And if the student is not prepared with good questions, you know, that I think is one of the biggest tells that, you know, that they're not as interested as maybe another student might be. So videotaping the student ahead of time, prepping them up to walk through their you know, answers, but then also making sure they have good, thoughtful questions so that when that inevitable question comes of what questions do you have for me, it can actually turn into a conversation instead of this one-way exchange or non-exchange.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that answer. And any final comments on recommendation letters or how to ask the right person for a recommendation?
Yes. On recommendation letters, I find that a lot of students feel like they need to ask someone who either has a big title or someone who they've, you know, maybe done the best in that class, right? The truth is that we have a transcript that can tell us, and a lot of times the people with big titles don't know you that well. The best recommendation letters come from people who have taught you multiple times, who have maybe seen you struggle a little bit in a class, but figure out a way to do well. Or someone maybe that both taught you and coached you, taught you and sponsored a club that you're in, saw you in different lights. Schools are going to be really specific about who they want to hear from. Sometimes they'll say they want it to be from someone who was just a junior year teacher, or someone who taught you in a humanities and someone who taught you in a STEM field. Sometimes they will be really open and say, you know, we'd like one from an academic and one from a non-academic. So they'll give you some of those guidelines. But at the end of the day, what schools are really looking for in recommendation letters is something that they couldn't get elsewhere. So a good recommendation letter is not going to regurgitate how well a kid did in certain classes, but it's going to talk to character, it's going to talk to perseverance, it's going to talk to who they are maybe within a classroom setting. Because ultimately that's what admission people are trying to figure out, is not just can the student do the work, but like, who's this person going to be in our classroom or in the residence hall or as an alum ultimately. And so recommendation letters can be really powerful when they can speak to that kind of thing.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I just wanted to hop back on and give a big thank you for your time today. I know you're calling in 3 hours later than us here in California. I really appreciate your perspective And I just want to let everybody out there know that we are working on our next gifted support group. Please look online for updates on the date for that. And in the meantime, we're posting content on our IEA blog. So you can go there and look at blog posts that are being posted quite frequently. We know you guys are at home. We want to make sure you have some content to engage with, some ways to stimulate your thoughts and brain and keep engaged. We also have an Instagram channel and our YouTube page. So there are lots of ways to connect with us, and please feel free to reach out to us with any questions you have. Last comments, I just want to say, make sure to check out this book. It has a lot of great information about how to stay connected and how to approach the hurdles that you're coming up with. And again, I really appreciate your addressing our current environment and situation, which is just creating some difference for all of us. So thank you for speaking to that.
Absolutely.
So, well,
Happy
have a
to
great
do it. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. Have a good evening, everybody. I love this little character you have here. This is great. Have a good evening, everyone.